The G20 Leaders Summit will be held in Delhi on September 9th and 10th. It'll be a big summit, perhaps the biggest and the most high-profile gathering of world leaders that Delhi has seen in a very long time, India has seen in a very long time. And given the current polarized state of the world, India faces a formidable diplomatic challenge in forging the consensus for the leaders' statement that will come at the end of the summit. To explain the G20, the process and the grouping and the challenges before it, we have with us here Shubhajit Roy, the diplomatic editor of the Indian Express. Shubha, welcome.
Thank you.
Shubha, first, by way of setting the stage for the discussion, what is the G20?
Okay, so G20 is a grouping of the world's biggest economies, largest economies, and it's a grouping of about 20 countries, actually 19 countries and one European Union.
Right.
So these 20 members, they comprise between them about 85% of the GDP, of the world's GDP, and 75% of the global trade, and 2/3 of the world's population.
Big, important grouping.
Absolutely. So they're basically the big boys of the world's economy. So they essentially they meet and they discuss about world's economic issues and political issues. So it started in 1999, but initially when they started at the finance minister's level and the central bank governors level, and but in 2008. What happened was when the global financial crisis hit, the countries, they thought that they should meet at the leaders level. So the US took the initiative and it hosted the first G20 summit at the leaders level.
As in the heads of state and government.
At the heads of states and the heads of government, basically the presidents and the prime ministers of these 20 countries. Now, these 20 members. And then, since 2008, initially they used to meet. They didn't decide on a frequency of meeting, but every year in the first 3 years they met twice a year.
Okay.
So essentially between 2008 and 2011 they met 6 times.
Okay.
And thereafter they started meeting every year, once every year. Mm-hmm. So this is the 18th summit. So far there has been 17 summits so far. This is the 18th summit that India is hosting. So that is what G20 started. And initially, actually, when it started in the late 90s, it was actually because of the economic crisis in Asia, the Asian tiger economies, which we know. Yeah. When there was a crisis here. And there was a sort of a mini recession that hit the world, or this part of the world. So that's how it started. But later, when the global economic crisis, financial crisis, it hit, then the leaders started discussing economic crisis at the leaders level. And slowly, first few years, they continued discussing with the economic crisis. But post 2011, they actually started incorporating, discussing political issues as well, and geopolitics became a dominant sort of theme of conversation apart from geoeconomics.
Why 2011?
So, if you remember, Arab Spring hit
yes.
in 2011, and it was at that point of time, the politics of the day was also determined by economics.
So the Arab Spring was this wave of protests across the Arab world.
Correct.
Pro-democracy protests.
Pro-democracy protests, but also they started also because of high unemployment and poor economic management in some of these countries. So essentially what happened was that there was a political color to the conversations, and that was the crisis of that time, that year. So it slowly broadened and expanded to other issues, like, in fact, climate change became a big issue because Obama administration was very big on climate change as its agenda. So it put climate change as part of the conversation. Similarly, as it progressed, now when the pandemic hit, the health and pandemic became a big topic of conversation. Digital public infrastructure, cyber security, because the world is going through so much of challenges. Then supply chain disruption because of the semiconductor crisis. Because chips, they are so, the disruption of supply of semiconductors became an issue. All these issues became part of the conversation at the G20 leaders level. In fact, if you remember when Kabul fell during 2021, the G20 leaders met specifically on Afghanistan to discuss the crisis of that time. So essentially, the leaders now of these 20 countries, they discuss the challenges of our times, of that particular time.
Got it. So it started off in response to the economic crisis, first in the 90s in Asia, and then in 2008, the global financial crisis. And as it became a leader summit, obviously the big challenges facing the global community at that time, they all became part of the agenda. Excellent. So Shubhu, one more thing. You have obviously covered so many of these G20 summits and you are meeting all these people who are coming. But tell me, just for us, the rest of us who are not as lucky as you are, this is the leaders summit that's going to happen, which means that all the heads of state and government are going to come to Delhi. I mean, the Nigerian president is already here and the others will be coming. But we have been hearing of G20 meetings, also B20 in various places, Jaipur, Amritsar, somewhere near Udaipur. That's right. So what's been happening there?
So, every country, when it assumes the presidency, it conducts it in a certain way, in different ways. So, for example, when Indonesia hosted the summit last year in Bali, they had about 20-25 meetings preceding the summit. So, what happens is that the leaders meet at the end of, towards the end of the year. Of the year. The year starts at 1st of December and ends on 30th of November.
That's so G20.
So the India's presidency started in 1st December 2022. It will end on 30th November 2020 this year. Now, before that, so leaders are meeting on 9th and 10th. But before that, you need to do preparations of the agenda. So what happens is what India did was it divided it into several subgroups, several working groups, which one deals with digital public infrastructure, one deals with health, the other one deals with, say, agriculture.
Right.
So similarly, on all the themes, they set up working groups, and the conversations are led by subject experts or the ministries which are in charge of those subjects in our country. And they invite counterparts from all the G20 countries who come and discuss. So essentially, over last 9 months, what has happened is the officials and ministers have sat and brainstormed what are the issues that they can frame consensus on and what are the deliverables that they can agree on. So, and that is also divided into 2 parallel tracks. First is the Sherpa track and the second is the finance track. So the Sherpa track essentially looks at mostly political and development issues.
Hang on. I'm going to stop you here. Sherpa track, you mean?
Yeah. So Sherpa is a word, obviously Sherpa is a mountaineer, mountain guide. Widely used in, if you're climbing, if you want to climb Mount Everest, you'll be a Sherpa. You need a Sherpa. So essentially, the top negotiator of a G20 country is called Sherpa.
Every country has a Sherpa.
Every country will have a Sherpa whose job is to assist the leader, which is the prime minister here and president somewhere, and they are the ones who conduct the negotiations and bring it to fruition and arrive at a joint statement, a joint agreed document.
Okay.
So the Sherpa is the topmost official. In India's case, right now, it is Amitabh Kant, who's a former bureaucrat, who's now the India Sherpa. Similarly, so Sherpas discuss mostly political and developmental issues. Basically the geopolitical and the development issues. The finance track is led by the finance minister and the finance secretary. So they deal with the finance issues. So at some level, they both talk to each other,
of course.
And it's interlinked and intertwined. But this is how essentially these two verticals, they negotiate the joint outcome document, and they come up with a sort of agreed draft joint communique and present it to the leaders. The leaders have to then sign off on that document that, they agree. And if there are any sort of problem or if there is any lack of consensus, then it's negotiated between the Sherpas. Or if it is not resolved, then it's lastly negotiated at the leaders level.
Okay. So basically, over these 9 months of the G20 year, these various working groups, they're brainstorming on a number of things. And finally, they're sorting these out. And one draft is presented. And then that's great. Okay, and Shubha, you just said that Indonesia was the president last year. So Indonesia handed the baton to India. And India is going to hand the baton to
Brazil.
Okay. So we keep hearing about India's presidency. So India's presidency will end at the end of the summit, and then is that right?
No.
Okay.
India's presidency will end on 30th of November. Because the presidency the G20 year lasts till 30th of November.
Okay. And then Brazil becomes
the next president on 1st of December this year.
Correct. So, and what is the role of the president? I mean, is there a G20 secretariat? How does that work?
So, it's there's no secretariat.
There's no secretariat.
There is no G20 secretariat. So, because it's a revolving presidency, each G20 member gets to become a president by rotation. There is a system which is called bucket system. Essentially, imagine 20 countries or 20 members being divided into 5 buckets. And so 4 to 5 member each in each bucket. To give you a parallel example, for example, FIFA World Cup, in the football World Cup.
That's right, all the groups.
The groups. Who kind of, so that kind of grouping is there. So from each grouping, one becomes the president, and then the baton passes on to the next group from where one becomes the president. So usually 3 members become a troika. So essentially the last member who hosted the summit, in this case Indonesia, India is the current president. And the next is Brazil. So India, Indonesia and Brazil right now comprise a troika. Because what happens is these global challenges, they don't vanish or appear automatically. So they are continuation and evolutionary in process. So what happens is that issues need continuity. What you discussed in Bali needs to be continued in Delhi. Then it needs to be...
Bali was last year's summit.
Summit. So issues, they have to be continued and carried forward. And India will present with some new ideas, which will now be tabled, which will now be, if they're accepted, then, but it will be implemented by Brazil and the next member. So that's a process.
It's a continuous process.
It's a relay race.
It's a relay race.
So baton will be passed from one to the other. So in Bali, in Indonesia, they, for example, had about 25 meetings, in the run-up to. But India decided that they will take it to every corner of this country. So almost every state at least had one G20 meeting, if not more. So you saw, as you were mentioning rightly, that you saw meetings in from Khajuraho or in a small town in MP or Jaipur, Amritsar, everywhere. And so India has had so far, I think, over 180 meetings over the year. they're planning to have over 200 meetings across 50, 60 locations. So that's what India's presidency has tried to bring to the table. They have, Amitabh Kant, to quote him, he says that we have tried to make it a people's presidency, essentially take it to the people. Now, so that's the nature of India's contribution to the presidency.
Okay, and obviously the president has a say in steering the agenda of the G20.
So the president actually shapes the agenda. It borrows, it takes forward the agenda, the items, the deliverables that were agreed in the past, in the previous summit and the previous summits, and it adds something new to leave its imprint.
Okay.
Its philosophical imprint, its materially concrete, deliverable imprint. So that's how the presidency essentially takes the agenda forward and might put new ideas on the table, which might be discussed, or they might be sort of debated. Some might be carried forward, some might not be carried forward.
So what are some of the ideas that India has put forward on the table?
So, for example, India put forward one of the ideas about this millet initiative.
Oh, right, yeah.
For promotion of millets in the world. So that is one of the
very
ideas.
Important, food security, etc.
So from food security perspective, then also there are ideas of digital public infrastructure, because India has sort of shown how this UPI has become a big success story. So it is trying to project that as one of the ideas. How can the world take it forward? Not every G20 country has a robust digital public infrastructure. So how can the world learn from that experience? So things like these will be part of India's sort of contribution, and those we have to see at the end of the joint communique, what all actually finally figures in the joint communique.
Right, and also the global south.
Absolutely.
The G20 also sort of bridges the global north and the south in a lot of ways, because...
So again, that was again a Indian intervention in this context. So far, every country has, member country which becomes a president has its own way of functioning. So it tries to invite countries of its choice. So India invited 9 member countries, and it also, because the fee, although
so these invitees are other than the 20,
other than the 20.
19 plus EU plus 9.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. So of which one is a permanent invitee. Spain is a permanent invitee.
Oh, that's interesting.
Across all G20 summits. And India has tried to contribute in 2 ways. One is try to bring the voice of the global south. So what it did in January was to hosted about a summit for about 120 countries, which are essentially global south countries, which are not part of G20, and it got its inputs, ideas from them, and it said that it will be the voice of the global south in the G20. So it acted as a facilitator to bring those ideas, that just because you 120 countries are not part of G20 doesn't mean your ideas don't matter.
Exactly.
To confront the challenges of our times. So for example, food security right now, because of the Russia-Ukraine war, has impacted the global south much more than ever before.
Exactly.
So therefore, the ideas, their thoughts were very important. So India has brought that into the table. The second idea that India has also put forward is again a continuation of the global south idea, is the pushing for inclusion of African Union as a member. Now, African Union represents the 54 countries of the continent of Africa. Now, it's a huge continent, and you have only one member from 2 members. One member, South Africa, is the only member there. So, in this kind of situation, India wanted that there should be more representation from Africa. And because you have European Union as a member,
right,
while you have 4 or 5 members of Europe,
right,
in
addition,
G20.
yeah.
So it's fair that Africa should also have its voice in G20. So
Correct.
India has mooted the proposal.
Okay.
So that is also one of the ideas for inclusion of African Union as part of G20.
So we just might see the African Union as a part of the G20.
We might see that. We'll see.
Okay. Acha, Shubha, you just spoke about the Ukraine war. Now, two very important economies, two very important leaders, President Putin of Russia and President Xi Jinping of China, they are not going to be there for the summit. Now, is there a first, I'd like you to tell us if that is a blow, but before that, what is the story? I mean, why have these two presidents and these two countries decided not to come? I mean, you could start with Putin.
So, Russian President Putin is not coming for the India summit, the G20 summit in India, because so this is the second time he is not coming to the summit. Last year in Bali also he didn't turn up.
Okay.
So
that was after the war had started.
So essentially, after the war started last year in February 2022, the Russian presidency, Russian government and the Russian president has been sort of waged in a bloody war, in a battle in Ukraine. And what has happened is that has polarized the world, the G20 community, the West, especially the G7 grouping and some other members on one side, and Russia on the other side. Russia has a benefactor in China.
Right.
So, so President Putin didn't turn up last year for the Bali summit in Indonesia because there was no agreement on sort of how to frame the Russia-Ukraine war conflict in the joint communique. Finally, they found a language which was acceptable to both sides, the West on the other side and the Russia-China on the other side, basically where they recorded the UN resolution which had deplored the invasion and all of that. And it also recorded Russian and Chinese sort of point of view in those two paras, which are now famously called paras 3 and paras 4.
Okay. So, of the Bali Declaration.
Of the Bali Declaration. Now, this year, it's now been a year and a half. The war is there's no end in sight to the war.
Yeah.
So, we still see the divergences to be pretty apart. And what has happened is the two sides have moved away from the Bali Declaration as well. Now, the Bali formulation is no more acceptable to both sides because both sides feel that, things have changed. For example, the Black Sea grain deal has collapsed, fallen apart.
Yeah.
Then, there has been much more nuclear rhetoric that has come into play post-Bali.
Yeah.
So, now there has been a bigger gap between the two sides. So they both feel that the Bali formulation is not suffice, doesn't capture the complexity after a year and a half. So right now, because there's a crisis, and President Putin has said that when he called Prime Minister Modi, he also conveyed that he's focused on the war, which he calls special military operation, and therefore he won't be able to turn up. So essentially it means that the hardening of position
on both sides,
that's why Russian President Putin is
choosing
to stay away from this particular summit, where President Biden will be there, or Macron will be there, or British PM Rishi Sunak will be there. So the Western leaders will be in attendance, in full attendance. And on the other side, the Russian president will not be there.
And he will be represented by Foreign Minister Lavrov.
That's right. So last time as well, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov had represented President Putin. This time, the same template is being used. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov will be present in India as of now.
That would have been an interesting situation. The West is actually fighting the war in Ukraine. They've arms supplies, aircraft, they've all kind of gone up, and it would have been difficult. So, and what's happening with President Xi?
So President Xi, there are two layers to it. One is as you know, India-China relations have suffered a setback in the last 3.5 years because of the border standoff. And these 50,000 to 60,000 troops on either side are right now along the India-China border in eastern Ladakh. And the relationship has, to quote the External Affairs Minister, he said it's abnormal. So India has always maintained that the border standoff impacts the overall bilateral relationship. So there have been attempts for rapprochement. The last such attempt was made by Prime Minister himself. Prime Minister Modi had a conversation in Johannesburg last month on the sidelines of the BRICS Summit with Chinese President Xi Jinping, where he conveyed
And was
the concerns.
President Putin there? No, he wasn't.
No, President Putin.
So he's not been
there.
traveling
no,
out.
He was not there. So the Indian Prime Minister, when he conveyed the concerns, after that the Indian statement said that the two sides have agreed to direct their officials for an expeditious disengagement, essentially to call off the standoff.
Yeah.
But the Chinese side statement spoke a different language.
Oh, wow.
So they essentially didn't even mention about such an agreed understanding. So there was a clear gap. So it looks like that the Chinese president is making a point or giving a message to India as well that the relationship is in a chill, has been impacted. So therefore he is not coming. The other issue is also taking off from the Russia-Ukraine war. It has clearly aligned itself with Russia much more than before.
Correct.
Short of supplying lethal arms and ammunitions to Russia, it has backed at Moscow at every level. So Russia-China convergence or alignment
Friendship with low limits.
Yes, that is truly blooming, we can see. And he has chosen to side with Russia and stay away from the G20 summit, possibly because there is no consensus on a joint declaration again at the end of the summit. So this sort of gives a message at both levels to India as well as to the G20 summit process, where President Xi is signaling that he is distancing himself from the G20 summit as a process.
And Shubha, you wrote something about China's Belt and Road and Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, that is India's. So is there a dissonance there as well in the language?
Yes. So as we speak, the Indian and Chinese negotiators are discussing the declaration along with others, where the Chinese wanted the One Belt, One Road as part of the communique. Because
of which India is not a part.
Of which India is not a part. India has made its reservations very clear that it is opposed to the idea, simply because it violates India's territorial integrity and sovereignty, because part of the One Belt, One Road, a significant part of One Belt, One Road initiative of President Xi Jinping, which is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, it passes through Pakistan-occupied Kashmir.
Yeah.
So India has made its reservation. So China essentially said that, your India's theme is one earth, one family, one future. So it is inspired from One Belt, One Road. So why don't you include One Belt, One Road in the joint communique? Indians obviously refused that, and Indians said that Indians wanted Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Now, the Chinese have Hindi and Sanskrit experts in their negotiating team as well. So they said that, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, if you translate it, it means the world is a family. One earth, one family represents that, but one future is not part of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. So the translation is not accurate if you try to conflate the two, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam and your India's theme, one earth, one family, one future. So one future is extra. So don't try to bring in a Sanskrit word which doesn't completely truly represent the Indian theme.
Serious
so there
diplomatic semantics, huh?
Yeah, so there is this sort of negotiation that is going on right now. We'll have to see how it plays out. In joint declaration, there will be there is tension between the two sides is spilling over in the negotiations.
Shubha, as you're telling me this, I mean, this incredible complexity of the language and the tough negotiations that they must be fighting over every word, every comma, every full stop. I mean, this in itself is so fascinating. Okay, so Shubha, quickly, so China is not there, Russia is not there. So is that going to impact the summit? I mean, has it in some way diminished the summit?
So, China's absence is very significant because, as I told you earlier, it is considered the world's biggest, the most premier economic forum. Correct. That's how it is known as. G20 is the premier economic
85%,
forum.
Yeah, of the world's economy. Yeah.
And if you saw the last BRICS declaration, it mentioned G20, where China is a part of and Russia is a part of. They both signed off on that paragraph where it said that G20, we support G20 as the premier economic forum. Few weeks later, both China and Russia opt out of attending the summit at the leaders' level.
Yes, okay.
Now, the world's second largest economy being not part of, not being attended at the highest level at the premier economic forum, it's a contradiction in itself.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, his absence is a big setback. And it also reflects, as I said, the divergence between the two sides, the West on the other side, the Russian-Chinese, the nexus, grouping on the other side. So this puts the joint communique at risk. That means the consensus, if it's not arrived at, their absence means there might not be a leader's declaration. That is at risk. Because if the G20 summit comes out with a declaration only if there is consensus. There has to be consensus amongst all the 20 members.
Okay, and if there's no consensus, there's no declaration.
There is no declaration. So what had happened was in the last 9 months, India held foreign minister level meeting, finance minister level meeting, central bank governor level meeting, agriculture minister level meeting, different vertical level meeting, and they couldn't come up with a joint communique. They came up with what is called the chair summary and outcome document, which is essentially India's distillation of the minutes of the meeting.
Okay.
So, which is not an agreed document because it still couldn't agree, get all the members to agree on the Russia-Ukraine paragraphs.
Got it.
So basically their absence would possibly impact and put the declaration at risk.
Okay, so then this some of it sounds pretty dire. So what is the best case scenario and what's the worst case scenario if you're talking of the outcome?
So the best case scenario is that India and the other members, they have come up with a series of deliverables. I'm told it's close to 50 deliverables that they have come up with. Some of them are very specific, very concrete. So we have to see what are those deliverables are. But obviously there will be a dissonance, divergence on the Russia-Ukraine war. So the best case scenario is you have a joint communique where there is a consensus on the Russia-Ukraine language as well, which Indian side is coming up with different formulations which might be acceptable to both sides. So I'm told there are about 7 or 8 such formulations.
Drafts, okay.
Drafts. And if they're agreed till the 9th, it's okay. They might go down to the wire till the 10th when the leaders meet. And finally, you may have a situation where the leaders have to come up and come up with a formulation.
Okay.
And Sherpas and foreign ministers and all the officials, negotiators will help them with come up with options. So that will be the best case scenario if a joint communique. If there is no communique, then there would definitely be a chair summary, which will list out the deliverables that have been agreed to, say from health to digital public infrastructure to education to skill development to yoga to everything. The entire range is on the table. So these are the two. So to my mind, in any which way, the world will see meeting of minds on a substantive area of issues, and there would be divergence on some issues.
So it's unlikely to be a complete disaster. That's the worst case scenario, and neither is it like to be everything is hunky dory. That's the best case scenario. Well, I guess that is the typical diplomatic outcome when it's such a complex process goes on. Thank you so much, Shubho. That was extremely informative, and I hope all of you who are watching this video also found it informative. Please continue to be with us. Keep watching the Indian Express. Thank you so much, Shubho.
Thank you.